When I started doing this video, I contemplated on animating an open animation for this video, but since almost everyone and their mothers has already reviewed this game, and since by the time this video comes out, it'll probably be October, I figured screw it. What's the worst that could— So, Spider-Man. Yeah, anyone who's anyone has heard of the wall crawler, and who can blame this world filled with pop culture? Movies, cartoons, comics, and of course video games. The webhead has been a staple of popular culture for decades at this point, and almost anyone on the internet has at least heard of the character at some point in their life. Marvel's moneymaker has seen ups and downs ever since his inception, from getting his spider bite that changed his life, to dealing with an almost endless amount of clones in one of the most confusing story arcs in comic book history, to the countless games where people can experience Spidey's daily life, but that entails the good and the bad. So now that I've talked your ear off for a minute, let's talk about the actual game of Spider-Man for PS4. A game, while not perfect, certainly doesn't need to be in order to be enjoyable. Oh yeah, this will be your only warning. I will be pretty much spoiling a lot of things in this game review, so people don't get complaining to me about talking about spoilers and— Son of a— The enjoyment of the game is mostly derived from the gameplay of Spider-Man. However, even that holds a few issues. So there are a few aspects of gameplay throughout the main campaign. The first being the Spider-Man aspects, which involves combat, traveling through the world, and collecting collectibles by doing various tasks. The second being— the stealth sections.
You get in my face with that, I'll beat your goddamn ass, you son of a bitch!
Now, when I say stealth sections, I refer to points where you are not the webhead, where you're Mary Jane or Miles Morales. Because there are stealth sections with Spider-Man in the game, but those fall more in line with the Spider-Man segment since you're still using the webhead and the mechanics in those segments are the same as using him.
Wow, these Oreos are the best!
And finally, there are the minigames, which, like a lot of people are like to comment on my videos, like they have a gotcha moment. We can just ignore those since they have no real merit and don't contribute anything significant to the actual game. Well, I should bring something with substance to the video and we'll talk. With the Spider-Man segments, there have been many people who have claimed that the game holds a lot of similarities to the combat system that's in the Arkham Batman games, in regards to pummeling the opponents and dodging with your spider sense when it goes off. In that regard, I can understand where people are coming from, but then again, it's a good system. It's preferable we get elements from a good combat system than have a bad system. What I don't particularly care for is people are saying that the game is only button mashing and it's a carbon copy of the Arkham combat system. These are people who have dipped way too much into the moonshine when talking about that, since while there are similarities, both series have multiple differences in the combat. One big difference is that Spider-Man's combat is more aerial-based. Enemies are much easier to confront and battle by pulling or knocking them into the air. The game gives you a few ways of making enemies airborne using your strong attacks by holding down the attack button, webbing them into the air, and knocking them off elevated platforms, as well as a few special moves that are capable of doing that. In addition, you're given more options on taking enemies down. Special moves, webbing them up, or even throwing things at them, a few ways of dealing with them. There's also the gadgets, which can limit your enemies' movements by using webs or electrifying them. And as you continue leveling and gaining more skill points, you can access more and more abilities to play with. If all you can do is button mash with a square button, then that's more or less falls into the player, and even then, that's not a wise thing to do since the dodge button is a thing, and using webs is also possible to use as well. And even by that logic, if you're only square mashing, then you're only doing yourself a disservice since there are challenges and skills that would limit your combat in that manner. Then again, I guess trying to make the game seem worse and mindless because of a certain kind of genre and is a platform exclusive at the time doesn't make me want to break out the good old baseball bat and ask someone to bash my head in with that stupidity.
All you ever do is complain.
Oh, but Carmen, are you white knighting the combat? I guess you must be a console fanboy. Not necessarily. That isn't me outright defending the combat system for the game. That's me pointing out the stupidity in some critiques I've seen on forum posts and in reviews. But I suppose that in order to fill the niche of the contrarian reviewer aspect and say something that goes against the popular narratives, I must stand up to the challenge. The combat does have some issues, and some of it comes from the hidden lock-on system. Think of the classic DMC3 lock-on system, only if Devil May Cry 3 decided to lick her up and put a blindfold on and attempt to make me think that Ruby Grim Eclipse was a good investment of money.
Oh, yes, Daddy!
Not that it breaks the actual combat, but in larger groups, Spidey would sometimes not hit the right guy that I would want to hit, even though I aimed at him, and that would result in me getting shot, pummeled, beaten up, tackled, whipped, and ended up me throwing a PS4 controller up against the wall to the point where I almost would die. Granted, me dying wasn't really an issue, even on the harder difficulty on my second playthrough of the game. Aside from the enemies having more health, that didn't really stop me from dying once or twice in the main campaign. So essentially the issue with the lock-on that I had would be dependent on the player and how I could adapt to the combat. And even I managed to get used to it with a bit more aerial combat style thrown in, pulling enemies up to me, throwing enemies, swinging into them, using the webbing and gadgets. The combat system has a lot of flexibility. If you're just gonna punch and kick guys, you're doing it wrong. That said, there are different kinds of enemies to deal with. You've got the regular guys, guys with guns, regular guys with blunt weapons, guys with shields, guys with webs, big guys who can be beaten with just by button mashing, and the guys with rocket launchers. There's one more group of enemy, but that's locked down to a single faction of the enemies that are in the game, and those are the flying guys that work under Sable. And to be fair, the Sable enemies are probably more interesting of the common enemies due to the fact they have other forms of weaponry and can stun Spidey in a different way other than just tucking grenades. Don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-guy, and don't get the wrong idea about the enemies. Each of the kinds of enemies have different methods of actually defeating and can be defeated in various ways. Like with the blunt weapon enemies, you need to hit them into the air since they'll block your attacks. Or the shield guys who you have to slide between their legs, and yeah, I'm gonna stop there since I don't need you two to tank my views even more because of a single joke. My point is, there is a bit of a blend with the enemies and how to deal with them. Much like how YouTube likes to group people into groups and make you lost in the crowd, much like how the enemies were in this game, save for a handful of exceptions. I don't know, Sable, the demons, the convicts, fistmen, and the regular criminals tend to mix a lot together in how to beat them on a general sense. Then again, when compared to Spider-Man's usual rogue gallery of rhinos, scorpions, and octopi, oh my, it tends to blend. Not that it was a draining through my first two playthroughs of the game, but the third time it began to be a bit more noticeable. Then again, when you're doing the same thing multiple times, it will get stale, much like food you leave out, or not bathing for a week, or trying to go through a video from someone who has the personality of a stale pastry. That's why the game offers you various tools, power-ups, and special moves. The special moves can range from giving yourself a strength boost, to electrifying your enemies when you hit them with physical attacks, or using the power of rock and roll. Or the deadliest of powers, making quips. You can access this power by pushing down the joysticks at the same time. When you gather enough focus to access it, and you can build focus in a variety of ways, and sometimes it can change the tide of the battle. Personally, I preferred using the ability where Spider-Man jumped into the air, spun around, and shot his, once again, making sex jokes with Spider-Man is way too easy. Thanks, Aunt May! Point is that these abilities are handy to use and can be used if you're in a tight spot. How you get these powers is by unlocking the various costumes that you have to get through the game as you level up and earn by varying collectibles. Plus side about this is if you're like a power-up but you don't like the costume, you can interchange the power with said costumes, which I'm of two minds with. On the one hand, it's good to have customizing the web head how you want, but the other kind just leaves the Spider-Man's costumes just to be aesthetics and not actually hold any other meaning than unlocking these abilities.
All you ever do is complain.
In addition to the super move, Spider-Man can equip 3 other passive abilities. These can be things like lowering the damage from bullets, improving your stats, to even having more stealth abilities. Then again, these are unlocked as you play the game, and you can equip them as you see fit to customize the webhead. And it's at this point that I've realized I've rarely talked about the focus aspect of the combat system, and if my script wasn't a mess already, I'll keep this brief. The focus bar is a bar that holds 3 major purposes: performing your special move, performing finishers, or healing. You start off with 1 bar, but as the game progresses, you'll eventually get more bars. Add these to the complexity of the combat, and you'll be making decisions on how to spend them. Do you use your special to get an edge in battle? Do you heal up? Or do you use your finisher on a certain enemy? That last one is something to consider because besides the brutes, if you use a special move on a regular enemy, you can knock them out in 1 finisher. The brute, however, requires at least 2 bars of focus to use the finisher on them, and it should be given that bosses do not fall to 1 hit. And Jesus Christ, I just spent about 5 pages devoted to the combat. What is wrong with me? Too long didn't watch? The combat's good, save for 1 or 2 hiccups here and there. And if you're not one of the many who died in my diatribe of the combat, that's because one of the major focuses of the game, and will probably be the second most thing you do in the game. The first being web slinging, which is something that everyone likes to talk about. It's a Spider-Man game, and one of the greatest things about Spider-Man games is the ability to zip and swing through the air. And for the most part, the web slinging is quick and fun, with you being able to power up, dive, and zip line through the buildings, giving you a little bit of variety. There were quite a few times where Spidey would dive through the bars of the water tower or the rooftop patios, giving a bit more of cinematic going here, but this is Spider-Man, a guy who's not above showing off and poking fun at his enemies. So where are the tricks? Well, apparently they are in the game, such as the Spider Roll, Dragon Roll, Helix... Wait, Helix? mean, as far as gameplay goes, it's not terrible. It's like that bottle of water you got sitting in the corner of your desk a few days. It's not bad, but you know you can do a lot better. Then again, it's still something you do in the game, and it does offer you a fast travel system, with Spider-Man riding the subway, and how jaded can you not be to notice Spider-Man on the subway on his iPhone? I know New Yorkers are supposed to be jaded and not tend to notice things, but this is a world where Spider-Man can fall from the sky and give some people high fives. Heck, you get experience for it. And experience is something that you need. Leveling up improves your stats, gives boost to various other things, allocates skill points, and you can get new abilities, unlock suits, and etc. You can get experience from a variety of things by doing story missions, side missions, and the collectible missions. This can be from taking pictures of landmarks, stopping crime, finding backpacks, performing scientific missions, taking out enemy bases, maybe even fighting pigeons. Wait, there's even a mission where you need to catch pigeons for Lee from The Walking Dead?
Been a bit of a whirlwind for both of us. They kicked me out of my place. They set all my birds loose. Pidgey's the only one who found me.
Point is, there's a lot to do in the Spidey part of the games, and the variety of the gameplay and what you need to do is there. If there's one thing I can criticize, is that the crime missions do tend to become a bit more repetitive. Although the game does try to fix this by giving each crime unique goals in order to get more crime tokens, but you can only do them once, and once you complete them, you can't really activate them again for those specific crimes. Now, we're at the times where you are Peter Parker, you don't last long in the mundane before you get back to being in the costume. They're pretty much not offensive by gameplay standards, even if, though I'm sure, consensus is that these parts break up the pacing of the game without actually explaining what pacing is. Pacing, in terms of gaming, at least to the cartoon robot on your screen who for some reason has a mug that he drinks from without a mouth, refers to the amount of action in games as well as how it flows. What tends to happen, however, is that pacing can also refer to aspects of the story. And any good story, you need to have action while having some downtime. The same can apply to video games. It was just an onslaught after onslaught after onslaught of enemies, people would be more than justified since non-stop action happened. The audience would get tired of it, especially if the audience needs to be able to digest any details that they need to take in.
Oh, that's good. That's very good indeed.
It reminds me of Outlast 2 in that regard, where there's an onslaught of action pieces with little dialogue, and that's comparable with binge-watching anything from the Paul brothers. A lot of fluff and no substance. I'll talk more about the actual story in an aspect, since we're now talking about the stealth aspects of the game, the one where you're not Spider-Man. As I said at the beginning of this bloated video, you're not only playing as Spider-Man, but you also play as Miles Morales and Mary Jane Watson. And no, you can't be Black Spider-Man.
Fuck you!
And before I explain why I hate these segments, it's probably the reason that people clicked on this video to hate on something popular. So let me make an analogy about this. If the game was a meal, consider the Spider-Man portions to be the main course, akin to something like a well-cooked steak. The civilian stealth missions, however, are the sides being akin to that of potato chips. Yeah, it's something you don't mind eating, but when served up next to something like the main course, it's something you would rather pass up since there's better food you can enjoy. Only in this aspect, it's Insomniac basically shoving these chips into your face when you don't want to enjoy them. If you want to talk about breaking pace, this is certainly it in the gameplay. And unlike other people, I'll actually explain why. When you're given a ton of freedom and abilities like Spider-Man, it will come to a hard stop when you're only allowed to play as normal humans who at best can only crouch and walk. Although eventually both Mary Jane and Miles do get very different ways to distract enemies or even temporarily deal with them. However, the biggest issue comes from the fact that you're now on a completely linear path for these segments. Yes, the game is linear, but at least with the segments where you're playing as Spider-Man, you had freedom on how to take down enemies. Like, do you pick them off one by one, use the hazards in the area to beat them, or do you go fists blazing? And these segments throw off that little bit of freedom out the window. They don't just throw it out the window, they toss it out and kill it. Honestly, you could cut the parts of the gameplay and the game would be better. I understand why they put them in here for a narrative reason to make sure we're not subjected to the Metal Gear Solid cutscene lengths. But just because there's a reason for something being there, that doesn't mean I have to like it. I mean, there's a reason why certain YouTubers exist, but that doesn't mean I have to like them. So now that we've gone over the aspects in here in terms of gameplay, let's talk about the story. Oh boy, the story. Not that it's a bad story, mind you, but it's just so generic. It didn't shake the earth for me, and it didn't really tread on anything new that I haven't seen in other games. But it's not like the game didn't do anything wrong with its story. Well, I lied. I am not the greatest storyteller, but there are times in the story that made me tilt my head. Like with Mr. Lee, or Mr. Negative as he's called, not being on the police's radar, when some of the dialogue implies that the captured demons named him in interrogations. Then again, in the grand scheme of things, you can take or leave the plot. I was more than focused on the gameplay, and hey, at least it wasn't a rehash of Spidey's origin story. Again. Thank you! However, in regards to the characters, there are some things I have to say. First, let's talk about Spider-Man. As I stated earlier, the wall crawler is supposed to be a smart aleck who makes witty quips while at the same time having a tortured soul behind the jokes. Much like how Vash the Stampede from Trigun. Doesn't help we got Yuri Lowenthal doing the stellar voice work of the character, so then the sarcastic and sometimes charming jokester. However, once you're doing a second or third playthrough, these jokes will tend to get a little sour on in the end. At least that's how it was for me. I can't speak for everyone, but it's akin to like the Deadpool video game, when he had all those witty one-shots.
Phew! That's what happens when you mix C4 with a bean burrito.
Can you just die?
Peter Parker and Spider-Man are probably the most complex hero in the comic book history, for better or for worse, and depending on the continuity, each version of the webhead has their own charms and issues. Whether or not you like this webhead is up to you. Me personally, I found myself enjoying the dialogue from the webhead, but others may not enjoy the quips. And as I said before, they do tend to get a little stale after the second or third playthrough. By the way, there's no New Game Plus yet. On the opposite side, we've got Mr. Lee, Mr. Negative, and frankly, the way the game was promoted ruined the idea. Because to be honest, I'm not completely familiar with all of Spider-Man's rogue gallery, so the possibility of there being a new villain in the game would have been an interesting take. Or a villain I had no idea about from the comics. At least until the promotional material screwed that up. What is with companies feeling the need to spoil these things? It completely screws up any extra surprise of the game, and while this isn't the worst example, it's still an issue. I get it. You want to make sure that your game is actually being sold, so you have to promote as much as you can. But you can't give away everything. What is with trailers doing this? It even happens in movies. And even then, Martin Lee's choices in the game are weird, since in the later half of the game, he teams up with Dr. Octopus to destroy Osborn and Oscorp, even though we learned that Doc Ock had a hand in giving Martin Lee's motivation, because he was partly responsible for how Martin Lee's parents died. But Martin Lee is willing to fight along Doc Ock with no problem. I could spend hours talking about what I liked and what I found bad about the story and characters, but then again, anyone can say that. Personally, I just want to get this on with this video before it becomes a chore to sit through, much like a lot of Telltale games. What? So aside from the story, let's talk about the presentation. One of the most beautiful aspects of the game is its transition from cutscenes to actual gameplay.
Yes! No way! I'm just in it? Whoa! Holy fuck!
Not gonna lie, I had the exact same reaction. Then again, you're listening to a guy who gets excited when he finds a gift card for the local pizza place in his pocket. So I'm not sure how much credence that'll lend to my credibility. When it comes to the game and how it looks, it does impress with the visuals. The character animations are smooth, the transition between cutscenes and actual gameplay are smooth, and there was only one actual time where I assumed there was an actual loading screen. However, that doesn't mean there weren't issues with the presentation. One such as there are times that I was stopping cars in the crime missions when Spider-Man was trying to stop the car by holding it up. Civilians would be running through the cars. Almost like ghosts.
He's a phantom.
I've heard that there were clipping issues and some people have enemies sinking through the ground, but I've never experienced that myself in my 3 playthroughs, before and after the first update. Granted, there are some interesting glitches I've seen online, but once again, I didn't experience them to that degree. I mean, unless you're like the Game Grumps who are actively trying to find glitches, from my experience, I never experienced these, but that doesn't mean others won't. So I can't say definitively they are affecting the overall presentation, and some people do like how outlandish the glitches are, others don't. Whatever floats your boat. If there's one more thing I can say, I'm pretty sure that this doesn't really fall under presentation, but screw it, I need to put this in somewhere. Whenever I do wall crawling, there would be a few times when the camera would fight me and make it hard to control the wall crawler as he was, well, crawling the walls. Now, I want to put this up to my own personal inequalities, controlling the camera and moving Spider-Man at the same time, but I felt that's something I need to bring up. But at the end of the day, it shouldn't come as a surprise that I'm recommending Spider-Man, especially if you happen to enjoy games like this. Action-adventure with fast-paced action. Then again, this game has already been reviewed to hell and back, and with titles like Mega Man 11 already out by the time I get this out, the flavor of Spider-Man is probably a bit overwhelming. Still, I'm glad I got this out, I just don't know how to end this, so I just will keep going until